So welcome everyone to this edition of Research Bytes, in which we will be covering the topic of sleep characteristics in elite youth athletes. And today with us, we have Dr. Haresh Suppiah, who was a senior physiologist with NYSI and also my predecessor as research coordinator at NYSI. So welcome to the Research Bytes interview, Haresh.
Thanks, Neha. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we're really excited to hear more about your recently published paper on sleep characteristics of youth athletes, which has been published in the International Journal of Sports Physiology and Performance. So could you start off by just telling our viewers a little bit about yourself and what you're up to these days?
Sure. So I'm Haresh Suppiah, and currently I'm a postdoctoral research fellow within the sport and exercise science discipline at Trobe University, based in Melbourne, Australia. And as you pointed out, prior to joining academia, I was a sport physiologist at NYSI. We were former colleagues, and so a lot of the work that I used to do really was supporting high performance youth athletes in preparation for regional and international competitions, specifically in areas such as sleep and recovery, athlete performance benchmarking, and also with conducting of different applied research projects. And currently, that's sort of extended in my current role. And I'm still looking at things such as recovery and physiology, but using the opportunity to sort of integrate and weave in different analytical techniques with some of the key interest areas that I have, which apart from sleep science would be strength and conditioning and talent identification and development.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for that introduction. So without further ado, I'd like to dive straight into it. So could you kick us off by telling us about what led you to conduct this research on sleep characteristics, and why is it particularly important to study this in elite youth athletes?
The genesis of this was really because some of the prior research that we had conducted at the NYSI, albeit in much smaller populations, really showed that this group had quite truncated sleep durations, nighttime sleep, for a variety of reasons. And we wanted to then, extend this out to the larger ecosystem and find out how, more athletes actually slept across these different sports. And I think, this study was really, a platform for us to get a sense of what the landscape was and see how we could, support athletes in terms of interventional methods, as well as determine if we could come up with a methodology to help the practitioner prioritize and optimize their strategies to support the athlete.
So that's really interesting. And as you brought up very important points. So first, on a hunch, just working with Singapore youth athletes, you would get this feeling that they're going to bed later and then they have to wake up earlier, especially the student athletes. So maybe you could briefly tell our viewers as well what some specific questions were that you asked in this study.
So what we really wanted to find out in terms of the aims and objectives was how did they sleep? What was in terms of the quantity and quality, as well as were there any other associations with things like the type of sport that they played in, and other nutritional related factors.
Okay, so some really interesting questions there, and we're keen to hear a bit more about the findings as well. So maybe you can start us off with just some main key findings that came out from the study.
Sure. So I think some top line findings that we saw was, we saw that 3 out of 4 of the athletes actually were getting insufficient sleep, at least insufficient based on what was necessary for the age group. And one of the tools that we use, it's called the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index. Based on that, we found that 1 and 2 were actually categorized as having as being a poor sleeper. And because we sort of had a very even split between the team and individual sport athletes, one question that we had was, was there sort of a better or worse group? Because based on prior evidence, it's been suggested that individual athletes actually have poorer sleep quality than team sport athletes. And sort of contra to what the prior evidence has shown, we found that our team youth athletes actually had poorer sleep quality than the individual sport athletes. So I think we go, into a fair bit of discussion in the paper where we sort of highlight that, yes, there are sort of, key differences between individual and team sport athletes. But even within, the individual and team sport athletes, like you see so many variances in terms of how they sleep, in terms of their bedtimes, in terms of their wake times, for example. So we were able to sort of see how, things like training demands actually dictate some of their behaviors, their sleep-wake behaviors. One of the other sort of interesting findings we had was that 1 in 2 of our athletes actually consume caffeine of some kind, with a much higher proportion of team sport athletes actually consuming caffeine. So we saw that 70% of team sport athletes actually consume caffeine, and 40% in individual sports. But the question that we had was, is the caffeine intake sort of a compensatory mechanism where they're trying to stay alert during the day? And those are concerns because then it sort of suggests that they're not potentially getting sufficient nocturnal sleep to take them through their day. One of the other more I think other sort of interesting things that we did in the study was we grouped the athletes through a cluster analysis. We used the unsupervised machine learning approach to sort of categorize the athletes into 4 different types. So we had athletes that were categorized as having good overall sleep. Another group had longer latency of sleep. That means they took longer to go to bed, and they had a lot of sleep disturbances at night. We had another group that were really short sleepers with higher daytime sleepiness. And the last group, which just pretty much had very bad sleep characteristics all around. And the reason why we sort of did this was to almost give practitioners, like sports scientists, for example, some way to sort of optimize their sleep support strategies. In that if you had a group of athletes that had pretty good sleep, you may not want to prioritize them up there in terms of sleep education interventions. So, those are some of the things that we sort of, did in terms of the algorithm to sort of elucidate and provide practitioners with some kind of real world takeaways.
So plenty of cool findings and a lot of information for us to process as well. So could you maybe tell us a bit more about how practitioners can really use some of this information from your study in helping them optimize sleep in youth athletes?
Yeah, I would say, like, if we talked about practitioners from the perspective of a sports scientist, I think methods such as a clustering technique. Like we use a k-means algorithm, and basically why it's termed as an unsupervised learning technique is that the technique does not actually know who is a good sleeper or poor sleeper. It basically comes up with these groupings on its own, and it I think prevents in some way potentially some kind of like preconceived notions that the practitioner might have. Like we may have had that notion that a team sport athlete may have been may have better sleep than the individual sport athlete. But when we dive deeper, it sort of showed us that even within the individual sport athletes, you do have poor sleepers as well, and in the team sport athletes as well, you do have ones that actually sleep better as well. So I think the practitioner wise takeaway could be potentially using techniques like this to sort of govern how they support and prioritize and optimize the sleep support strategies, because I'm fully aware that it's a very difficult thing to go around and help everyone with their sleep, and you want to make that time quite meaningful. It has to be quite bespoke.
So what you're saying is with this K-cluster analysis that you do, you can have a sort of unbiased view of grouping individuals based on their sleep characteristics. And in a way, it can help practitioners to customize their support so that it's the most effective in that sense. So you're targeting the group of sleepers that actually needs that support.
That's right. And, in some ways, like, although this study was done contextually within sleep support, there's no reason why this approach cannot be done, say, with, athlete dehydration, for example, where you almost, find out what are the factors that the athletes are struggling with and sort of group them according to those difficulties and provide that sort of bespoke intervention.
In terms of improving sleep, there's a bit of work done around napping and caffeine. So is this one way in which we can tackle this issue as well?
Yeah, so we'll maybe talk about napping first. So napping generally does help in terms of complementing the nocturnal sleep durations, but it has to come with a caveat in that you don't want to sleep too close to bedtime. So generally not within 6 hours of what bedtime is. Try to keep it relatively short. If athletes are looking at napping as a performance enhancement tool, that's where it kind of has to also be further considered. Our sort of suggestion there is to try it out first and practice napping. I know it sounds weird, but the research shows that if you are a habitual napper, it actually improves performance versus someone who does the one-off nap. You tend to wake up feeling extremely tired because of sleep inertia, and then performance actually declines. With caffeine, it definitely has to be used quite judiciously. Caffeine, too late in the day will have a negative impact on nighttime sleep. So although there's an abundance of research showing that caffeine actually has got sport performance enhancement properties, I think there's a need to sort of predetermine what's the point of the caffeine when the athlete takes it. Is it for, say, a competition, for example, or are they taking caffeine regularly on a daily basis just to stay awake? If it is the latter, then the underlying issue, which is not enough nighttime sleep, has to be tackled first.
Okay. So now I'm going to challenge you a bit here, Haresh. So if you could give our viewers one message, or maybe two at most, that they could take away from your recently published paper, what would that be?
I think, if I had to sort of boil it down to one thing, it would be that for youth athletes to get better sleep, it has to go beyond just the athlete. So it has to be, two-pronged in terms of the responsibility. You have the athlete who can only control that micro environment, things that they eat, looking at a device and their sleep environment. But, things that are beyond their control, what time they go for training, school, those are things that are sort of impacted and influenced by significant others. So it's only when, those significant others are on board as well, that's the only time that the youth athlete can potentially get better quantity and quality of sleep. So say, for example, if, a school team, for example, had a really late competition last night, the teacher in charge and coach, for example, could decide, if they had pre-planned training the next day, it may actually be worth, not having training at all, and consider that added sleep as part of recovery. And because sleep in itself has been shown to improve performance, if they were to sort of reframe sleep as an actual training extension in some ways, because you actually continue to improve on certain attributes while you sleep, in terms of your protein synthesis, for example, your learning consolidation, and sort of give the athletes added time to rest on certain days. I think that's an important takeaway.
Big message there. So it's not just up to the athlete themselves, but it's very much to do with the environment around the athlete. So if we're looking to optimize sleep in elite youth athletes, it's not just all on the athlete, but we as practitioners and organizations need to be thinking about that as well. So thanks so much, Haresh. And thank you all for joining us in this edition of Research Bytes. So to find out more about this study on sleep characteristics in elite youth athletes, you can click on the link. And until then, stay tuned for our next Research Bytes. And thank you and stay safe.
Thanks, Neha.